green tech in general, and just to establish my bona fides here, I've got a solar system on my house. I believe in the climate change data. I'm not a skeptic on that. I'm a skeptic on the technologies that we seem to have all latched onto to fix it. So whether you're looking at wind or solar, whether you're looking at EVs or e-trucks, the materials that you need, you're talking in excess of an order of magnitude more in order to build the stuff compared to conventional tech. So for example, your conventional car has about 2 pounds of copper and maybe 5 or 6 pounds of nickel. Your average electric car needs, 130 of each. It needs all kinds of materials that we don't normally put into vehicles, and they have a global supply chain and global sourcing, most of which are in very uncomfortable places. So, 60% of the cobalt comes from one place, and the second biggest source just went offline in Russia. So while we can't have inexpensive oil without the Russians, we absolutely cannot have the green transition without the Russians. And that plays for almost every piece of everything. In the Western Hemisphere, to a degree, this is less true because a lot of those raw materials are sourced here or maybe in Australia. I expect that to still work. But if you're in Eurasia or Africa, no, absolutely not. Having a house with solar and a battery system, that might work for about a tenth, maybe a tenth of the US population. We're the first world country with the best solar profile. But if you're not in a kind of a belt from central Texas to Los Angeles, roughly, you're not going to have enough solar intensity to be able to power a house. Also remember that if you've got a 6 kilowatt solar system, which is about as big as you can put on most houses, it's going to take 3 days to charge your Tesla, assuming you're not using the power for anything else. I think these are all interesting technologies. I just don't think we're there yet. I think that nuclear is going to be a bigger part of the future than a lot of people think because, believe it or not, its supply chain is simpler. Even with non-proliferation concerns, it's simpler than it is for solar panels. With today's technology, we're talking Australia, the United States, Mexico, Britain, Denmark, assuming they can get their head out of their asses, Argentina, and Chile. Those are the only countries in the world that have a good enough green tech, solar, and wind profile to theoretically get more than half of their electricity from a really robust build out, and that I'm not counting the cheating that places like Denmark are currently doing, where they have a lot of wind towers, but they still source the majority of their power from the European grid. I'm talking about if you're doing a standalone national system. Those are the only ones. It doesn't mean that it can't help with the margins for other places, but our energy intensity and the energy density problems of solar and wind just haven't been surmounted yet in other locations where it's less favorable. Net zero with today's technology, until we have figured out a low-cost mass storage electricity system. And that means storing electricity not for 4 hours, but for 4 months, so you can make it through the winter. Until we have that technology, net zero is really dumb from an environmental point of view. Forget from an economic point of view. It's suicidal from an economic point of view. But from an environmental point of view, there isn't enough lithium on the planet to make that work. Now, in the UK, you do have advantages over almost everyone else in your hemisphere because the UK has some of the best wind resources of the world. And if you put a wind turbine high enough, you can tap stronger currents that are more reliable that can actually generate base load. We're seeing that in the North Sea. In the United States, we're seeing that in Texas, and we're seeing that in Iowa. It's not foolproof, but wow, is it better than what we had 5 or 10 years ago. So I don't mean to suggest you can't green your system. I'm just saying that getting to zero today is not possible. And if you try, and if you do it by decommissioning more reliable energy producing systems, which almost by default means nuclear or fossil fuel, you are going to have high prices and rolling brown and blackouts. We are seeing that across Central Europe right now. The technology just isn't there. So it's real. That doesn't mean you should give up. People have bought the ideology, unfortunately, without looking under the hood. We're just not there yet. And Europe is now giving us an excellent example of 40 years of policy of what exactly not to do. Net zero in its current form with today's technology is economically and ecologically suicidal. We've got the Ukraine war then.
The Russians have recently shut off Nord Stream, and we know that all the pipelines that are crossing Ukraine to Europe are going to get blown up one way or another this calendar year. So you can count on roughly 4 to 6 million barrels a day of crude and roughly 9 to 12 BCF. So what's that? 90 to 120 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year going offline before the end of the year. And that will obviously sucker punch everyone in Europe repeatedly. Again, UK has a little different system. You're further from the Russians. You hardly use any of their stuff. You have the option of taking stuff from the North Sea first. You have closer access to LNG from the United States. So you're going to be able to watch Europe. And when you're not giggling, because that would be rude, you're hopefully going to learn a few things on what not to do as you're adjusting your own energy plans. But all of that is going to be inflationary no matter who you are. We're losing potash fertilizer that used to come from Russia and Belarus. We're losing phosphate fertilizer, which used to come from China. And we are losing nitrogen fertilizer, which is made from natural gas globally. So we know food prices have to go up. Again, I don't see the UK starving, but that contributes to inflation. But what's really going on, in my opinion, is a labor story. In the UK, in the US, our largest generation has been our baby boomers. They're all retiring right now. And the kids who are 0 to 20 who are now moving into the workforce, they are the smallest generation that either of our countries has ever seen. In the United States, that is already an annual shortage of 400,000 workers. In my country, that's going to go up for the next 12 years until we hit 900,000. So we are looking at labor inflation here being higher than inflation in energy and food and manufactured goods combined for a decade. The German system has 4 pillars of support, and without all 4, it doesn't work. Number 1, inexpensive energy supplies from Russia. It's the only place that the Germans can get the stuff cheap, and it forms the basis of their heavy industry, which provides the materials for their medium and their light industries. So if something happens in the base level, it's not just that they have a problem with electricity, although they do. It's that they no longer have the materials that's necessary to make plastics or to forge steel or to do anything downstream of that. The Nord Stream pipeline went offline yesterday. There's a concern, a very real concern, that it's never going to come back on. What's going on right now is that the Russians are trying to blackmail the Germans into backing out of NATO. It's that simple. Because without German assistance, there are no logistical means of getting equipment from the rest of NATO into Ukraine. End of story. So the Germans are being forced to decide between being industrialized and neutral or unindustrialized and Western. Not a fun conversation to have. The Germans are the fastest aging society in Europe. They're in the top 5 globally. Germany is not a country where you can have an open, honest, national conversation about population policy. And it shows. And so they now have more people in their 60s than their 50s, than their 40s, than their 30s, than their 20s. Until now, this has worked. Because when you have a lot of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s without kids, they can work long, they can work hard, they can get better educated. They're the most productive workers on the planet. But that group that is in the 60s is now flipping into retirement this decade, and that changes things overnight, going from an advanced worker base with lots of experience to a retired worker base where the experience is irrelevant. That happens this decade. That was always going to happen this decade. This was always going to be the last decade of the German manufacturing model. Third, it's not just about the Germans. A successful manufacturing system requires different stages of production with different workforces, with different skill sets at different costs. The Americans do this with Mexico. The Germans do this with Poland and the Czech Republic and Romania and Ukraine. And it's now over. And then finally, you need globalization. Because when you have an advanced population that's top heavy, you don't have enough people to consume. You have to export the stuff. And the Americans have lost interest. So it's not just Nord Stream. That's just the proximate cause of the day. All 4 of these pillars were already breaking. The demographic ones were definitely going to break completely this decade. And with the Americans, it all depends upon our mood. And then, of course, the Russians are just forcing things into the light right now. So the German manufacturing model cannot survive the 2020s the Russians get to decide whether it survives 2022.
They didn't move away from coal. They didn't move away from coal. They're using more coal than they've ever used, and that was before the war. They now get their single largest fuel source is lignite. Their number two source is coal. Their big mistake was shutting down nuclear if your goal is to be carbon neutral. And I'm not saying that the Germans are stupid. They live in a very difficult neighborhood, and anything you can do in that neighborhood to make one neighbor hate you less is generally a good thing. And whenever the Germans and the Russians hate each other, things gets very real very fast. So I understand why they did it. But I would hold out Germany as the shining example of how green tech doesn't work in most places, because they've built out 100, and I think they're up to 155% in terms of generating capacity, 155% of their peak demand in generating capacity from wind and solar, but it only generates about 7% of their actual electricity because Germany is neither sunny nor windy.